is there some sort of heavenly court of judgment in the Bible? This question, it comes with some different passages to consider, and really it comes from a trend in the religious landscape right now and some confusion, I think, about what really goes on behind the veil. A lot of the discussion, if you'd like to be turning to Psalm 82, a lot of the discussion about this question is centered on Psalm 82. We'll just go ahead and read that psalm in its entirety. Psalm 82, beginning in verse 1, it says, God stands in the congregation of the mighty. He judges among the gods. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the poor and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and the needy. Deliver the poor and the needy. Free them from the hand of the wicked. They do not know, nor do they understand, that they walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are unstable. I said, you are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. But you shall die like men and fall like one of the princes. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all nations. Warren actually preached on this psalm a few years ago, and I'm going to defer to him in its explanation. It really doesn't take much study or thought to know that this is not talking about other gods. I'm not sure, I should have looked, I'm not sure that all translations even use the word gods there. But obviously it's not talking about other gods, because there's only one God, and there's only one true God, and there's plenty of passages that we could look at to see that. But the word that is translated gods in this psalm is Elohim, and the Bible uses that word to talk about powerful beings in general. And so some translations might say mighty ones instead of gods in Psalm 82. And so reasonably speaking, there are some who would say that this is talking about God rebuking angels or spiritual beings of that sort, or even human judges in positions of power, or both. And Warren, I thought, did a really good job in his sermon on this psalm of laying out the argument that this is talking about human judges, because in the context it's talking about responsibilities that would belong to them. So in verse 3 and 4, for example, the responsibilities towards the poor and the fatherless, the afflicted, and the needy. And so if you want a more in-depth explanation of that psalm, you can go listen to the sermon that Warren did on that. I think it's titled Yahweh versus the Gods. So you can look that up. But let's go back to our question, because I think there's more than just this psalm to consider. Is there some sort of heavenly court or council, I'll throw that word in there, of judgment? I want to take Psalm 82 out of the conversation for a moment in light of Warren's explanation of it. If you can talk to him after services if you've got more questions. But I want to consider this question as two separate questions, because there are spiritual beings who are not gods who do stand in God's presence, and we see several passages about that in God's heavenly court, and He does interact with them. But I think it's important that we notice how He interacts with them and what kind of conversations He is having with them and what those conversations are doing. If you'd like to go ahead and turn to Genesis 18, part of the confusion is that there has been, there's a book, really a series of books that are popular in these conversations, and they use words like divine counsel or heavenly counsel, heavenly court. And I don't think that conjures up a very biblical picture in people's minds. God does not need help to make decisions about things. He is not part of a committee. He is not even the head of a committee. He doesn't need people. He doesn't need angels or any other being to give him advice. But he does sometimes choose to interact with people for other reasons. And so in Genesis 18, we read about this conversation between God and Abraham about the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. And at first glance, it might seem as though God is allowing Abraham to have input on this decision. But the reality is that God already knew what He was going to do before He ever talked to Abraham. In verse 22, we see that the angels that were going to get Lot, they were already walking towards Sodom and Gomorrah before Abraham even spoke. Someone might fairly say that this chapter describes God taking counsel with Abraham, but I want you to notice that this conversation is purely for Abraham's benefit. God's sense of justice is not being affected here but Abraham's sense of justice is. And so in verse 17, the Lord says, speaking to himself, he says, "Shall I hide from Abraham all that I am doing, since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have known him, in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him." God doesn't need to learn anything from this conversation, but Abraham does need to learn some things. God isn't struggling over what justice would require of him in Sodom and Gomorrah, but Abraham is about to learn how true justice and mercy works. He is learning to keep the commandment of the Lord and to rule righteously in his household, and the Lord is allowing him to participate in this conversation for that purpose. And when people talk about a heavenly council or something to that effect, I think this is what they're often missing, or at least what becomes confused by terminology that might not accurately represent the Bible. God does not need help, but he does sometimes delegate authority in order to teach people. He does not need dialogue to make up his mind about things, but he does sometimes allow people like Abraham to take part in conversations for their learning. And what that also does is it gives the beings that God talks to the ability to either submit to him or to rebel against him. And that's what I see in Job chapter 1. You turn to Job chapter 1, and verse 6, it says that there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also was among them. And so here is a gathering of spiritual beings. Not all of them are good spiritual beings, and God has some discourse of some sort with them. And the conversation goes as you read to this man named Job, who is a righteous man. And Satan believes that he is only righteous because of how God has blessed him. And so Satan challenges God. And he says, "Let me work on this Job guy, and I will get him to curse you." In verse 12, God tells Satan to do what Satan does, to behave according to his nature. And I think that sometimes we may miss that one of the most major points of the book of Job, most of the book focuses on Job, and so it's fair that we might miss this, but one thing I'm not sure that Job ever really knew was that all of this happened primarily because God was teaching Satan a lesson. Satan came into the presence of God with all these other spiritual beings, and he was thinking that he was going to teach God something about faithfulness and loyalty. But instead, God taught Satan through the faithfulness of Job. God knew what was going to happen. Satan had no advice that he could offer, but God used Satan's pride to teach a lesson for all of us and for all of those spiritual beings who were standing in his presence about what it means to be faithful and to think correctly about God's authority and power. In 1 Kings chapter 22, we'll take that thought into 1 Kings chapter 22, and we see another example of spiritual beings conversing with God. In verse 19, Micaiah the prophet, he says, "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the hosts of heaven standing by on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, Who will persuade Ahab to go up that he might fall at Ramoth-Gilead? And so one spoke in this manner, another spoke in that manner. And then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, I will persuade him. And the Lord said to him, In what way? And so he said, I will go out, and I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all of his prophets. And the Lord said, You shall persuade him and also prevail. Go and do so." I want you to notice the similarities between this interaction, 1 Kings, back to Job chapter 1. What is different is that this time, God is saying that there is a job that needs to be done. Ahab is not a righteous man or a faithful man like Job. He needs to be dealt with. And so this spirit comes forward and basically is playing the same part as Satan in Job chapter 1. Let me go after this guy. I will get him to fall. But because Ahab is an unrighteous man, God knows that this is not going to turn out the same way as it did for Job. And so just as he allowed Satan to do to Job what Satan does to people, he allows this lying spirit to go do to Ahab what lying spirits do to people. And again, these are not gods. They are not They are not a heavenly council in the sense that they're not affecting God or giving Him advice or anything like that. But God is using spiritual beings that He has called into His presence to carry out specific purposes. And He is revealing these conversations for our learning. And one of the reasons I think this is so important for us to understand is that I believe these conversations and these interactions with spiritual beings that go on behind the veil, I think they're still bearing consequences today. Paul said in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 1, he says, "The Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and the doctrines of demons." In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 10 through 12, Paul said that because people did not receive a love of the truth that they might be saved, for this reason God will send them a strong delusion that they should believe a lie and that they shall be condemned who did not believe the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness. These deceptions have a source. They spread through humanity, but why? It's because God has allowed lying spirits to do what lying spirits do. And He allows people who love unrighteousness rather than truth to believe those things. It has been true throughout history that things and beings who are not God have been treated like gods. And that's still a problem, even if people do not associate what they are doing with idolatry. That's what it is. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verses 19 and 20, let's look at that. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verses 19 and 20. Paul is talking to the Corinthian Christians who it seems that they still have one foot in the pagan temple. He says, "What am I saying then? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to idols is anything? No, rather that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons." And so Paul is pretty clear here that the idol is not real. The idol isn't anything, and yet it came from somewhere. And the concept of an idol, the idea of an idol, that's serving somebody, and it's not serving God. And it is putting you in league with spiritual beings who do not serve or submit to God. There's a lot going on behind the veil that we do not get to know, but God has revealed enough to us in His Word to know that there is something happening, and that what happens in this physical realm and what is happening in the spiritual realm, they have an effect on each other. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 10 that the manifold wisdom of God is made known by the church to the principalities and powers which are in the heavenly places. There are lessons that God is teaching through us to spiritual beings by the way that we submit or rebel against God, just like Job and Ahab. There are lessons being taught to us by the way spiritual beings tempt us or help us. Hebrews 1 and verse 14 tells us that angels are ministering spirits sent forth to minister to those who will inherit eternal life. But then on the other hand, we've got Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12 that tells us that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. May God give us the faith to see the unseen as we participate in this spiritual warfare, both to see those who are for us and those who are against us. And may God grant us a love of the truth so that we do not fall for the deceitfulness of the wicked one and his minions. So does God have a heavenly council that helps Him rule the universe? Not in the sense that God needs any help with anything, or in the sense that there are any other gods but Yahweh, but there are spiritual beings that interact with God behind the veil for their learning and for ours, whether in His service or in rebellion against Him. And at some level, they might even interact with us.